The morning she found him, the coffee was still hot. Dorothy Calloway had made the same walk every single morning for 40 years. Down the hallway of the Beacon Hill townhouse, past the framed photographs, and the antique side table Walter had bought at an estate sale in Connecticut, up the curved staircase with the mahogany banister, she polished herself every Sunday without being asked. She carried the coffee in a blue ceramic mug, his favorite, the one with the small chip on the handle that she had offered to replace a dozen times, and he had refused a dozen times. She balanced it carefully the way she always did, because the carpet on the top landing was slightly uneven, and she had learned long ago to slow down at that exact spot. She pushed open the bedroom door with her shoulder the way she always did when her hands were full. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are not supposed to be quiet. Walter was lying on his side facing the window, the gray morning light falling across him in the same way it had fallen across him 10,000 mornings before. But something was different, something that Dorothy understood before her mind could form the words for it, something that registered in the body before it registered in the brain. She stood in the doorway for a moment that felt very long, and she looked at the man she had spent 40 years loving, and she knew. She set the coffee mug on the nightstand, carefully, as if noise might disturb something. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed on her side of the bed, the side she had slept on for 4 decades, and she put her hand on his shoulder the way she had done countless times when she wanted to wake him gently. His shoulder was cool beneath her palm. The room was gray and quiet, and the coffee steamed softly beside the lamp, and Dorothy Calloway sat there for a long time before she reached for the phone. Walter Harrington Calloway was 84 years old. He had been one of the most respected estate attorneys in Boston for more than half a century. He had a voice that could silence a courtroom without raising at hands that were still steady at 80, and a presence that made other men straighten their posture without knowing why. He had built his reputation over 50 years on precision discretion and an almost legendary patience. He was the kind of man who planned 30 years ahead as a matter of habit, who saw consequences others couldn't see, who understood that the most important moves in any contest were the ones made long before anyone realized a contest had begun. Dorothy had been 28 years old when she became his wife, and she had been his secretary for 6 months before that. She remembered the afternoon he had asked her to dinner with the same clarity she remembered her own name. She had been at her desk in his outer office organizing deposition files when he had appeared in the doorway of his own office and simply stood there for a moment looking at her with an expression she had never quite been able to read. He was 44 years old that year, broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, carrying himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in the room. He had asked her to dinner at a restaurant she had never been able to afford on her own salary, and she had said yes, and 6 months after that, he had asked her to marry him, and she had said yes to that too. What she had not fully understood that evening, sitting across from him in the warm light of that restaurant, was that she was not simply saying yes to Walter Calloway. She was saying yes to everything that came with him. The house, the career, the social obligations, and the 3 children from his first marriage who had made their feelings known before the wedding cake was cut. Gordon had been 22 that year. Even then, he had the look of a man who believed the world owed him something specific and was perpetually annoyed that it had not yet been delivered. He shook Dorothy's hand at the rehearsal dinner with the practiced warmth of a politician greeting a constituent he would never see again. Cecilia was 19, beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful when they have learned to weaponize it, her smile as sharp as the edge of good crystal. Barrett was 17 and said almost nothing, which Dorothy had initially mistaken for shyness, before she understood it was simply that Barrett had learned early to let his older siblings do the work of making their displeasure known. Cecilia had found Dorothy alone in a powder room during the reception and had said very quietly in the tone of someone sharing a helpful piece of information, "You will never be our mother." Don't even try. Dorothy had tried anyway. For 40 years she had tried. She remembered every birthday and every graduation. She sent thoughtful gifts for every occasion, attended every event she was invited to, and many she was not technically unwelcome at. She hosted Christmas and Thanksgiving in the Beacon Hill townhouse, cooking elaborate meals that were consumed without comment, maintaining the guest rooms, as though the children still lived there, even though they visited as rarely as they possibly could. She bit her tongue through years of cutting remarks about her background, her community college education, her origins, her failure to give Walter more children, and through all of it, she had built what she believed in her bones was a real marriage. She had managed the Beacon Hill townhouse the way other people manage institutions. She entertained Walter's colleagues and clients with the ease of someone who had learned to make every person in a room feel like the most important person in the room. She adapted to his schedule, supported his career, remained faithful, and devoted through 4 decades, and told herself that the distance she sometimes felt was simply the nature of a marriage between two adults who had come to each other already formed, already complicated, already carrying the weight of lives fully lived before they found each other. Walter had been kind to her in his way. He provided generously, ensured she was dressed appropriately for the social world his career required, never raised his voice, and never raised his hand. He was thoughtful about certain things in ways that still surprised her. Even after 40 years, the way he noticed when she was tired before she said so, the way he had every single Valentine's Day, without exception. Left a single white gardenia on her pillow without a card, because he knew she found cards performative. But there had always been a part of him kept carefully apart from her, a distance she had never been able to close. He maintained the study on the second floor as a space that was entirely his own, and she had respected this without question because he had asked her to only once early in their marriage with a gentleness that made refusal feel impossible. There were financial accounts whose statements she never saw, business matters he handled entirely separately, and then there were the trips. Once a month, sometimes more. Walter would pack a bag on a Friday morning and drive somewhere he described only as a property he had inherited from a relative, a place he went to decompress, to think, to be alone with the work he brought with him. He never invited her. She never asked to come. She had accepted this the way she had accepted most things in their marriage, with a trust so complete it had never occurred to her to question whether that trust was being honored. He always came back on Sunday evening. He always brought her something small from wherever he had been: a jar of local honey, a bunch of wildflowers, a piece of interesting driftwood he had found somewhere. She had kept every one of those small things arranged on the windowsill of the kitchen where the morning light hit them. She had never questioned any of it. That was the fact she kept returning to in the days after she found him. Not the grief, which was enormous and strange, and not quite what she had expected grief to feel like. Not the loneliness, which set in almost immediately and was its own separate weight. But that particular fact that she had spent 40 years trusting completely a man she had not. She was beginning to understand, known completely. And she could not decide whether that was a failure of love or simply the shape that love had taken between two people who had come together under complicated circumstances and done the best they could. The funeral was everything Walter's life had been: large, impressive, and organized entirely by other people. More than 300 people filled the church on Commonwealth Avenue on a gray Thursday morning in March. Judges and partners and former clients' families whose estates Walter had managed for generations, colleagues from the Bar Association, prominent figures from Boston society who appeared at such events as a matter of civic obligation. Dorothy sat in the second row, which Gordon had arranged with an explanation so smooth it was almost admirable. "We thought you might want family nearby," he had said, which was a way of saying that the front row was for the real family, the blood family, and Dorothy, despite 40 years of marriage, did not qualify. She sat in that second row in her black wool coat, and she watched 300 people grieve a man she was not sure any of them had known as well as they believed, and she kept her hands folded in her lap and her face still. The eulogies were numerous and polished. Colleagues spoke about Walter's legal mind, his integrity, his contributions to the profession. A retired judge described him as the finest estate attorney he had encountered in 50 years on the bench. A former client, a woman in her 70s, became visibly emotional while describing how Walter had managed her family's complex affairs through 3 generations with patience and skill that, had she said, genuinely changed their lives. Not one of those 300 people mentioned Walter Calloway as a husband. Not one person acknowledged the woman who had stood beside him, managed his home, supported his career, accompanied him to every one of these professional events for 40 years. Dorothy sat in the second row and she understood that she had been in some official way. She was only now beginning to see clearly and visible. Present but unacknowledged. Essential but uncounted. Gordon spoke last. He was 50 years old and he had his father's height and his father's posture, but not his father's stillness. Gordon was always in slight motion, always managing something, always alert to advantage, in the way that men who have grown up with wealth and resented sharing it tend to be. He spoke about his father's legacy with genuine feeling, real feeling, which surprised Dorothy until she understood that Gordon's grief was sincere, but entirely self-referential. He was grieving the man who had made Gordon's own life possible, the foundation on which Gordon's sense of himself had been built. He used the phrase the Callaway name 3 times. He spoke about responsibility and stewardship and the obligation to protect what had been built. And at a particular moment in the speech, the moment when he used the word legacy for the second time, he looked directly at Dorothy. It was a brief look, a single second, maybe less, but it contained everything she needed to know about what the next weeks would bring. At the reception afterward, held at Gordon's home in Brookline, Dorothy found herself standing near the catering table with a glass of water. She was not drinking close enough to a cluster of Cecilia's friends to hear what was being said without appearing to be listening. This was a skill she had developed over 40 years of being present in rooms where her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Cecilia was speaking with the practiced grief of a woman who had spent considerable time in the mirror rehearsing it. She was describing the loss of her father, the closeness of their family, the comfort of having each other through such a painful time. Her friends offered the expected responses. And then one of them, a well-dressed woman Dorothy had seen at various events over the years, without ever learning her name, asked about the estate. And the shape of Cecilia's grief shifted just slightly the way weather shifts before a storm. She said only, "We'll know more after the reading." But the way she said it, that controlled brightness, that careful containment of something that wanted very much to be visible, told Dorothy that Cecilia already had a reasonable idea of what the reading would contain. Dorothy drove home alone that evening to the townhouse that was no longer hers in any way she was beginning to understand, and she sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. The reading of the will was scheduled for 10 days after the funeral. It was held in the offices of Arthur Nolan, the attorney who had handled Walter's estate planning for the past 20 years. Arthur Nolan was 65. A quiet, careful man with reading glasses he kept on a chain around his neck, and a reputation for absolute discretion that had made him, Dorothy had always thought, very like Walter in the ways that mattered professionally. Dorothy dressed carefully that morning. A dark gray dress, her good pearls, the wool coat. Her white hair was styled the way Walter had preferred it, which was a habit she recognized even as she was doing it. 40 years of shaping herself to another person's preferences had made certain things automatic. She drove downtown through the March cold, and she told herself in the elevator on the way up that there was no reason to be afraid. 40 years, surely. Surely 40 years of devotion meant something in the document that governed what happened next. Gordon and Cecilia and Barrett arrived together as she had expected. They brought their own attorney, a younger man in an expensive suit, who arranged himself at the conference table with the efficiency of someone who had performed this exact role before and expected to perform it again. They greeted Dorothy with the careful politeness of people who have already won something and are simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. She sat alone on one side of the table. They arranged themselves on the other, a united front, which was what they had always been when it came to her, even when they disagreed about everything else. Arthur Nolan began with the legal formalities, speaking in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned that the only mercy available was clarity. He described the estate, approximately $8.7 million in total, including the Beacon Hill residence, valued at $2.1 million investment and retirement accounts, totaling approximately $6 million in various other assets. He said this without inflection, which was its own kind of mercy. Then he turned to the specifics. The Beacon Hill residence, Arthur said, is left in its entirety to Walter's children from his first marriage. Gordon Callaway, Cecilia Calloway Reed and Barrett Calloway, to be divided equally or sold with proceeds distributed among them as they determine appropriate. Dorothy felt the cold begin somewhere in her chest. The investment accounts valued at approximately $4.2 million are similarly distributed equally among Gordon Cecilia and Barrett Calloway. The cold spread. The retirement accounts valued at approximately $1.8 million. Same distribution. Dorothy heard herself speak, and her voice was quieter than she intended. Arthur. I don't understand. What did Walter leave for me? Arthur Nolan looked at her over his reading glasses, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected, not pity exactly, but something heavier than pity, something that looked like genuine pain. He said, I am required to read this section verbatim. He cleared his throat. He looked at the document before him. Walter had written, my wife Dorothy Ann Calloway has lived comfortably at my expense for 40 years and has wanted for nothing during the course of our marriage. She has had the benefit of my wealth, my home, my social standing, and a lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved independently. This constitutes more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she has provided over the years. Each word was its own small wound. Companionship, domestic services, the language of a contract, the language of an employer describing the value of an employee at the end of a satisfactory professional arrangement. Across the table, Gordon had gone very still in the way that men go still when they are working to contain satisfaction. Cecilia was examining her hands with the studied indifference of someone performing studied indifference. Barrett had his phone out. Arthur continued, the will states, while I have appreciated Dorothy's presence in my home and her efficient management of domestic affairs, my primary obligation is to my children and my bloodline. They are my true legacy and the continuation of the Calloway family name. Therefore, I leave to Dorothy Ann Calloway only the following. One property located at 47 Ridgewood Lane in the town of Harwick, Massachusetts, along with all contents therein. This property is given with the express understanding that Dorothy will vacate the Beacon Hill residence within 30 days of my death, as that property is required by my rightful heirs. The room was perfectly silent. Barrett's phone clicked once. Gordon broke the silence by opening his folder and beginning to discuss the timeline for listing the Beacon Hill property. He spoke about market conditions and staging requirements and the need to begin the process as soon as possible. He was businesslike and efficient, and he never once looked at Dorothy while he spoke, which told her everything she needed to know about how thoroughly he had already filed her away. Cecilia mentioned in a tone of such careful sympathy that it was its own kind of cruelty that she recalled Walter mentioning the Harwick property years ago. She said it was something he had inherited from some distant relative back in the early 80s, a falling down house in the middle of nowhere, not worth the trouble of selling. She said, at least you'll have a roof over your head with the practiced charity of someone who has never once had to worry about having a roof over her own. Arthur Nolan slid a brown envelope across the table. His hand, Dorothy noticed, was not entirely steady. Inside the envelope was the deed to the Harwick property, now transferred to her name. There was a key, old and iron, the kind that belonged to a different century. And there was a single sheet of Walter's expensive stationery with his familiar, precise handwriting. 47 Ridgewood Lane, Harwick, Massachusetts. Dorothy, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You will understand everything once you arrive. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before, but they were always watching, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love always. Walter. Trust me one last time. After he had just described her as adequately compensated domestic help. After he had left her essentially homeless with nothing but an unknown address in a town she had never heard of. Dorothy folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She picked up the key. She stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and she walked out of Arthur Nolan's conference room without saying another word to Gordon or Cecilia or Barrett or their expensive attorney. She made it to the elevator. She made it through the lobby. She made it to her car in the parking garage. And then she sat there for a very long time and did not cry because she was too numb for crying, too hollowed out for tears, and also because she refused in some fundamental and unexamined way to cry in a parking garage. What came instead of tears was a kind of reckoning, a cold, clear-eyed look at the landscape of her situation that she had not permitted herself to take before. Because before this morning, there had been no situation to look at. She was 68 years old. She had no job, no career, no work history that extended beyond 1984. She had no family. Her parents were gone. She had been an only child, and 40 years of being Walter's wife in Walter's world had slowly, without her fully noticing, replaced the friendships and connections she had possessed before him. She had the clothes she had been wearing to other people's events for 4 decades, the books in the study, the photographs on the windowsill from the kitchen. She had a car that was 10 years old, and she had a rusty iron key and an address she had never heard of. The 30 days that followed had a particular texture that Dorothy knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Not because of what was done to her, though what was done to her was done with a thoroughness that suggested considerable advanced planning, but because of what she discovered about herself during those 30 days. What she found underneath the years of accommodation and compliance and careful self-erasure. Gordon, Cecilia, and Barrett came to the Beacon Hill townhouse nearly every day. They brought contractors and interior designers and real estate agents and movers who came to give estimates, all of them moving through the rooms of the house with measuring tapes and color samples and the confident efficiency of people who have already taken possession of something in their minds. They discussed renovation plans and staging strategies and comparable property values. They spoke about knocking down the wall between the kitchen and the sitting room, ripping out the garden terraces she had spent 30 years cultivating, modernizing the facade in ways that would remove every trace of the particular character the house had accumulated over the decades. They never asked Dorothy to leave rooms. They simply walked into rooms where she was present and continued their conversations as though she were a piece of furniture that had not yet been removed. It was done with such consistency that Dorothy eventually understood it was not carelessness. It was a message being delivered in a language that did not require words. The first of the 3 moments she would always remember most clearly happened on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks into the 30 days. Dorothy was sitting in the kitchen at the table where she had eaten breakfast every morning for 40 years, drinking tea and reading, when Cecilia came in with a woman Dorothy did not recognize, someone with a portfolio under her arm and the look of a professional whose time was valuable. Cecilia did not acknowledge Dorothy's presence in any way. She moved through the kitchen, describing what she planned to do with the space, the wall that would come down the island, that would go in the window, that would be enlarged to bring in more light. She spoke about Dorothy's kitchen in the tone of a woman describing a canvas she was about to paint over. Dorothy sat at the table and held her cup and looked at the window above the sink where 40 years of small things from Walter's trips were arranged on the sill, and she did not say a word. The second moment happened the following week. Gordon was in the back garden with a real estate agent, both of them looking at the terraced beds that Dorothy had planted in the spring of 1987 and had maintained and expanded every season since. She could hear them through the open kitchen window. The agent was saying that the garden was significantly overgrown, that it would need professional landscaping before the property could be listed, that first impressions were critical in this market. Gordon agreed, said they would bring in a crew, said the whole thing would probably need to be cleared and started fresh. They spoke about her garden, her 37 years of work, her roses and her perennials, and her carefully planned sequence of bloom from March through November, as though it were a problem to be solved rather than something a person had made with love over the better part of a lifetime. The third moment was the one she carried with her when she left. On the night before her final day in the house, she could not sleep. She was in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, standing at the counter with a glass of water when she heard Gordon and Barrett in the dining room. The house was old, and the walls were not as thick as the architecture suggested, and sound traveled in ways that people who had grown up there learned to account for. But Gordon and Barrett had never lived there long enough to know this. Gordon was saying the Harwick place isn't worth $50,000, maybe less. Dad was easing his conscience. That's all that was. Barrett said something she couldn't quite hear. Gordon again, she has no skills, no connections, nothing. Without us, without the house, without Dad's name, she's just an old woman who used to be someone's secretary. That place will probably fall down around her ears inside a year. There was a brief silence, and then Barrett said something that might have been agreement or might have been discomfort, and then Gordon's voice again, lighter now, moving on. We should talk to the agent about the garden situation in the morning. I want that cleared before we list. Dorothy stood in the dark kitchen with her glass of water, and she looked at the things on the windowsill. A small jar of wild honey from somewhere in western Massachusetts, 3 smooth river stones, a dried sprig of something she had stopped being able to identify years ago, but had kept because he had brought it. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to the study which she had not entered since Walter's death, and she stood in the doorway and looked at his desk and his shelves, in the particular silence that the room had, the silence of a space that has been carefully maintained against intrusion, and she thought about the note in the brown envelope. Trust me one last time. She was not sure she could, but she was also out of alternatives. On the morning of the 30th day, Dorothy woke before sunrise and walked through every room of the house one final time. She had expected to feel the weight of 4 decades, and every step expected to be overwhelmed by accumulated memory. What she felt instead was something closer to clarity. The master bedroom was a room. The kitchen was a room. The sitting room, the dining room, the study, all rooms all belonging to other people now, in all the ways that mattered legally and practically. The only place that pulled at something genuine in her chest was the garden, where she stood for a few minutes in the cold, gray morning light among the roses she had planted in the 2nd year of her marriage, looking at the careful order of it, knowing it would be cleared and started fresh within the month. She had packed 3 suitcases over the previous 2 weeks. Clothes, practical things, the wool coat. 2 boxes of personal items. The photographs from before her marriage letters. Her mother had written her over the years. Several books that had belonged to her grandmother. The wedding photograph that she had removed from the mantel over Gordon's objection that it was technically house property. She had looked at him for a long moment when he said that, and something in her face had made him stop pursuing the argument. She loaded the car with the suitcases and the boxes and the photograph. She checked the windows and turned off the lights in every room. She took the blue ceramic mug with the chipped handle from the kitchen cabinet and wrapped it in a dish towel and put it in the box with the books. Gordon arrived at 11:30 early, which she had expected. He stood in the foyer with his hands in the pockets of his coat, and he did not quite meet her eyes, and he told her the movers were coming at noon, that he would handle the keys, that she should take her full time and not feel rushed. He delivered all of this in the tone of a man who has practiced a speech about being reasonable and wants credit for the performance. Dorothy stood at the bottom of the staircase, and she looked at him for a moment. She said, "Gordon, do you have any idea what it is to give someone 40 years and be told it amounted to nothing?" His face went through several things rapidly. He said, "Father left you a property. You're not getting nothing." She said, "Your father left me a mystery, a house I've never seen in a town I've never heard of. You and your sister and brother got millions of dollars in the home where I spent my entire adult life. You got the public confirmation that you mattered to him. I got a rusty key and 30 days to disappear." Gordon opened his mouth, and she was already walking past him out the door to the car. She got in and she started the engine, and she did not look back at the Beacon Hill townhouse, where she had spent 40 years being someone's wife, someone's hostess, someone's domestic services provider. The GPS showed 2 hours and 19 minutes to Harwick, Massachusetts. She had never heard of Harwick, Massachusetts. She pulled onto Commonwealth Avenue in the mid-morning traffic, and she set her hands on the wheel, and she thought, whatever is at the end of this, I will not fall apart over it. She was 68 years old. She had spent 40 years holding herself together in rooms where she was not fully welcome, and she could hold herself together for 2 hours and 19 minutes on a highway heading west. Her dignity was still intact. She intended to keep it. The drive west out of Boston took her through the familiar landscape of the metro area, the density gradually thinning as the highway opened up, the city releasing its grip mile by mile. She drove without music because she needed the quiet, the particular kind of quiet in which you can hear yourself think without the interference of sound that has opinions about your mood. She drove through small towns and stretches of woodland and past the kind of landscape that appears ordinary until the light hits it a certain way and it becomes something else entirely. Harwick, Massachusetts announced itself first as a reduction in road. The highway became a two-lane county road, and the county road became something narrower still. And then there was a sign, modest and weathered, that read, Harwick population 2,847. And beyond it, a small town that looked as though it had been assembled carefully over a very long period of time by people who understood that things built to last require patience. Main Street was perhaps 200 yards long, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign, a diner with a blue awning and checkered curtains visible through the glass, a small post office, a library that Dorothy could see even from the car had been built in the 19th century and maintained with the kind of care that comes from a community that considers its library essential rather than optional. A white church with a simple steeple. A general store on the corner with a wooden sign that said Briggs & Sons established 1961. Dorothy drove slowly down Main Street in her 10-year-old car with her 3 suitcases and her 2 boxes and her chipped ceramic mug and the brown envelope on the passenger seat, and something happened that she did not immediately understand. People stopped. Not all of them, and not dramatically. There was no crowd gathering, no sudden stillness. But a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the hardware store paused mid-sweep and looked at her car, and then looked at her through the windshield with an expression that was not curiosity. A woman coming out of the diner stopped with her hand on the door and turned to watch Dorothy's car pass, nodding slightly, the way you nod when something you have been waiting for finally arrives. 2 older men on a bench outside the post office exchanged a look that Dorothy could not read, but that contained something specific, something shared, something that had been held between them and was now being confirmed. She was being recognized by people who had never seen her before. She did not understand this yet, but she noted it with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 40 years watching rooms carefully and learning to read the things that happened in them without words. Her GPS directed her left off Main Street onto a road called Ridgewood Lane, which started as pavement and became gravel and then became a dirt track that led into a forest of oak trees, so old and so large that they seemed less like individual trees and more like architecture. Their branches met above the road and created a canopy that filtered the March light into something quieter and more specific. And beneath them, the dirt road was soft and dark and pressed on either side by roots so substantial they had become part of the landscape in the way that permanent things eventually do. She drove slowly, the car moving carefully over the rutted ground. The forest was dense and absolutely quiet. She could see nothing ahead except the road and the trees and the particular light coming through the bare branches. And then she stopped the car, because there was a man standing at the edge of the road perhaps 20 yards ahead of her. He was older, perhaps in his mid-70s, a large man who had gone soft in the way that large men sometimes do in age, but who still carried himself with the solidity of someone accustomed to physical work. He wore a canvas jacket and a wool cap, and he was standing in the road as though he had been standing there for some time, watching her car approach. Dorothy sat for a moment, then she rolled down her window. The man walked toward her car with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows exactly where he is and exactly what he is doing there. When he reached her window, he stopped, and he looked at her with the same expression she had seen on the faces of the people on Main Street, not curiosity, not surprise, but the particular look of recognition and readiness. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, my name is Harlan Briggs. I run the general store back in town. Walter and I were neighbors out here for nearly 40 years, almost since the day he first inherited the place." He reached through the window and he handed her a basket covered with a check cloth, warm and heavy, and he said, "Bread, eggs, coffee, some basics. Figured you'd need supplies. The house is maintained, but there's no food in it. There's a good market in town when you're ready." Dorothy took the basket. She said, "I don't understand. How did you know I was coming? How did you know what I look like?" Harlan Briggs looked at her with steady gray eyes and he said, "Walter told us you'd come after he was gone. Said to watch for you. He showed us photographs. He talked about you every time he came out here, which was every month for nearly 40 years. Said you were the most capable woman he had ever known, and that when you finally arrived, we should make sure you knew you were expected. He paused, and something in his face became more careful, more deliberate. He said to make sure you knew you were welcome, Mrs. Calloway. He said you might arrive thinking you'd lost everything. He wanted someone to be here to tell you that you haven't, that it's the opposite of that. Dorothy sat in her car in the shadow of the old oaks with a basket of warm bread in her lap and a rusty iron key in the brown envelope on the passenger seat, and she looked at Harlan Briggs standing in the dirt road of a town she had never heard of, and she felt something shift in the exact center of her chest. Not relief, not yet. Too much had happened too recently for relief. But the first very small loosening of the particular tightness that had been there since the morning she had found Walter with his coffee going cold on the nightstand. The first suggestion that the story she had been told in that conference room, the story of what she had lost and who she was and what her 40 years had amounted to, might not be the only story there was. She looked at the road ahead at the old oaks and the filtered light and the dirt track leading deeper into the quiet forest, and she thought about the note in the brown envelope. Trust me one last time. She put the car in gear. She drove forward. The road ended in a clearing. Dorothy sat with the engine running for a moment, and she looked at what was in front of her, and she did not speak because there was nothing to say and no one to say it to, and also because what she was seeing required a kind of quiet to absorb properly. The house was built from fieldstone gray and dark, and fitted together with the particular precision of a craftsman who understood that the work would outlast him by centuries. 2 stories steep, slate roof, intact white-painted trim around windows whose glass caught the thin March light and held it in a way that leaded glass does, breaking it into something more complex than ordinary light. A heavy oak door under a covered portico with carved wooden supports, dark with age and weather and what looked like decades of careful oiling. Ivy grew up the east face of the stone in long, organized lines. Not the ivy of neglect, but the ivy of intention shaped and maintained into something that softened the severity of the stone without obscuring it. The grounds surrounding the house were overgrown in the way that formal gardens become overgrown when they are not tended but also not destroyed. She could see the bones of the original design beneath the wildness of it. Stone pathways half covered by grass, rose beds gone untrained but still blooming in the remnants of their planned arrangement. What had clearly been a kitchen garden now given over to the productive chaos of herbs and self-seeded flowers, and the particular exuberance of plants that have been left to follow their own logic for a season or two. A stone fountain stood at the center of what had been a formal garden area, dry and silent, its basin holding a collection of leaves and winter debris, but structurally sound, its carved figure still intact. It was not what Gordon had described in Arthur Nolan's conference room. It was not a falling down house in the middle of nowhere. It was not worth $50,000 or anything close to that figure. It was, Dorothy understood with a clarity that arrived without warning, beautiful. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment longer. Then she got out of the car and she stood in the clearing in the cold March air, and she looked at the house that Walter Calloway had apparently been visiting every month for nearly 40 years without once mentioning it to her. And she tried to understand what she was feeling and found that she could not, because what she was feeling was too large and too complicated and too many things simultaneously to be named as a single thing. Harlan Briggs had followed her in his truck, and he parked behind her and came to stand a few feet to her left, giving her the space of the moment without removing himself from it. He said after a while he kept it up himself mostly. Came out every month and did what needed doing. Hired local people for the bigger work. The roof was redone about 12 years ago. The plumbing was updated 8 years back. He was meticulous about it. Said it needed to be right. Said it needed to be ready. Dorothy said, ready for what? Harlan said, for you, Mrs. Calloway. He always said for you. She walked toward the front door. The stone pathway was uneven but solid underfoot, the old field stone worn smooth in the center from years of use. She reached the portico and she looked at the heavy oak door, and she took the iron key from the brown envelope and she put it in the lock. The key turned smoothly. Not the grinding resistance she had expected from something that looked like it belonged in a different century, but a clean, well-maintained action, the tumblers moving with the ease of a mechanism that has been regularly oiled and kept in working order. The door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all. The interior was warm. That was the first thing. The house was warm, not the artificial warmth of a thermostat recently engaged, but the deep, settled warmth of a space that is habitually inhabited, that has held heat long enough for the walls themselves to hold it. The wide plank floors glowed with the particular amber of old wood, maintained with care, their surface worn smooth and slightly uneven, in the way that floors worn by generations of use become uneven. Each low spot a record of where people had stood repeatedly over years. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mantel carved from a single piece of oak, a few pieces of split wood arranged in the grate. Built-in bookshelves flanked the fireplace, filled with leather-bound volumes, arranged with the attention of someone who cared about order. A comfortable leather sofa warned to the softness that good leather achieves only over decades. Several chairs positioned to take advantage of the light from the leaded windows. Hand-woven rugs in muted colors on the floor. And the photographs. They covered every available surface, every wall, every shelf edge, arranged on the mantel and the side tables and the windowsills, framed in everything from simple wooden frames to more elaborate ones, some clearly old, some newer, arranged without any particular system except the system of accumulation over time. Dozens of them, more than dozens. Every single one of them was Dorothy. She stood in the center of the room and she turned slowly and she looked at herself, looking back from every direction. Dorothy at 28 on their wedding day, her expression containing the particular quality of someone stepping towards something enormous and not yet understanding its full dimensions. Dorothy in the garden of the Beacon Hill townhouse, kneeling in the soil with her hands in the earth and genuine, uncomplicated joy on her face. Dorothy reading in the armchair by the sitting room window, caught in the completely unguarded posture of someone who does not know they are being observed. Dorothy laughing at something out of frame, her head tilted back, the kind of laughter that cannot be performed. Dorothy sleeping in a chair on what appeared to be a porch afternoon sunlight across her hands. Dorothy at 30, at 40, at 50, at 60. Dorothy in different seasons, in different lights, in different ordinary moments throughout 40 years of a life she had thought she knew completely. He had been watching her. Not in the way that word usually implies, not surveillance, not the gaze of control, but in the way that people watch things they love and cannot stop seeing. He had been carrying a camera through 4 decades of monthly visits to this house and photographing the woman he had left at home, capturing her in the moments she was most fully herself, bringing those moments back here and framing them and hanging them on these walls in this house that she had never known existed. Walter Calloway had built a private museum of his wife. Harlan Briggs stood in the doorway and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. And because he understood that what was happening in this room required silence, the way certain things require oxygen. Dorothy stood in the center of the photographs, and she felt the first real tears of the week since Walter's death begin somewhere deep in her chest. Not the shocked, dry grief of the morning she had found him, or the frozen numbness of the conference room, or the brittle anger of the 30 days being made invisible in her own home, but something genuine and complicated and completely without warning. The tears of someone who has been handed evidence of something they had stopped believing was true. She stood there and she let it come, and Harlan Briggs waited in the doorway until it passed, and then he said quietly, "Let me show you the rest. Then I'll leave you to settle in. But there are things you need to see first." He took her through the house with the care of someone who has been entrusted with the showing of it. The kitchen was large and practical, an antique wood stove standing alongside modern appliances that had been installed with enough thought to coexist with the age of the space. A farmhouse sink deep enough to fill a stock pot without difficulty. Copper pots on hanging racks, open shelving, with dishes that looked like they had been chosen individually rather than in a set, each one slightly different from the next. The dining room had a long table of dark oak that could seat 12 and clearly rarely had. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, each simply furnished and clean, each with its own fireplace, each with windows looking out over the forest or the clearing or the ruins of the formal garden. The master bedroom had more photographs on the walls, more of Dorothy, more ordinary moments of a life lived 2 hours away that had somehow been transported here and preserved with the devotion of someone who needed these images around him. The house had been winterized properly, the pipes insulated, and the heating system serviced. The roof showed no sign of leaks. The windows, despite their age, were sealed adequately against the March cold. The whole of it spoke of consistent maintenance performed by someone who intended it to last and had planned accordingly. Back on the main floor, Harlan led her to a door set under the staircase that she had not noticed, small and plain, the kind of door that reads as a closet. He opened it and stepped aside. It was a study, perhaps 10 feet by 12 with no windows, the walls lined floor to ceiling with built-in shelving, and instead of books, the shelves held document boxes and binders and manila folders, all of them labeled in Walter's familiar handwriting, precise and unhurried, the handwriting of a man who had spent 50 years putting important things down on paper and understood the obligation that came with that. The fourth wall had a mahogany desk, small and carefully chosen, a green-shaded banker's lamp, a leather chair worn to the shape of someone who had sat in it many times. On the desk, in the exact center, positioned with the deliberateness of something placed rather than left, was a thick, cream-colored envelope with 2 words on the front in Walter's hand. My Dorothy. Harlan said that's what he wanted you to find. He told me about it, told me to make sure you got to this room. He said everything you needed to understand was in that envelope. He stepped back toward the door of the study. He said, I'll be in the kitchen when you're ready. Take whatever time you need. Dorothy sat in Walter's chair and she picked up the envelope and held it for a moment without opening it. The wax seal on the back was dark red, pressed with what she recognized as his signet ring, the one he had worn for as long as she had known him. The ring she had noticed was not on his hand the morning she found him. She did not know where it was now. Perhaps Cecilia had already cataloged it. She broke the seal. 5 pages of Walter's stationery covered front and back in his careful handwriting, the letters small and even and without the wavering she might have expected from an 84-year-old man, but that Walter had maintained right up to the end because his hands had been steady until they stopped entirely. She read, My dearest Dorothy, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And you found the house, and I imagine you've had some days or weeks that were among the most painful of your life. I know what the will said. I know what those words must have felt like sitting in Arthur's office and hearing yourself described in that language. I need you to understand that I wrote every word of it deliberately with calculation and with purpose, and with the full knowledge that it would hurt you in ways I cannot adequately apologize for. She paused, she breathed, she read on. Gordon and Cecilia and Barrett have been looking for reasons to challenge my decisions regarding you for years. Since before we were married, in fact, you don't know this, and I am sorry that you are learning it now, but Gordon retained an attorney in 2009 to explore whether our marriage could be challenged on grounds I won't dignify by naming. I became aware of it, and I handled it quietly, and I handled it in a way that made certain it could never be attempted again. But that episode told me everything I needed to know about the lengths they would go to if they believed their inheritance was being reduced by any provision I made for you. They were always watching, always listening, always prepared to act. The only way to protect you was to give them no reason to act, to make the will read exactly as they expected it to read, to give them everything they wanted so completely that they had no legal grounds to challenge anything else. So I gave them what they wanted: the house, the accounts, the visible wealth, the public confirmation of their primacy. I gave them the inheritance they had been counting on since before you and I were married, and I gave it to them in a way designed to look like everything they hoped for. And then I gave you what matters. She read about the deed, about the property having been transferred to her name in 1984, 3 months after their wedding, established as a gift, entirely separate from their marriage, a legal distinction that Walter had spent years making bulletproof, a structure he had revisited and reinforced every few years, As estate law evolved always with the same goal, the deed was hers alone, had been hers alone for 40 years. No court could reclassify a gift properly established and documented in 1984 as a marital asset in 2024. She read about the trust, a fund Walter had established through a bank in Western Massachusetts, separate from his Boston accounts, separate from everything connected to his estate. A fund designated solely for the maintenance and ongoing expenses of the Harwick property. Utilities, property taxes, insurance, repairs, any reasonable maintenance required to keep the house in good condition. Funded for 50 years. Untouchable by his estate, untouchable by his children. Untouchable by any legal challenge they might attempt because it was not part of his estate. It had been established separately, funded separately, documented separately for decades. She would never pay a bill for this house, not one. She read about the land, 247 acres of protected woodlands surrounding the house, and the clearing assessed the previous year at approximately $3.2 million by two independent appraisers with documentation of interest from conservation organizations that had approached Walter multiple times about acquisition. The decision to sell or retain was entirely hers. The land was in her name, had been in her name in the same legal structure as the house since 1984. She read about the filing cabinets in the study around her. Walter wrote, "I spent 50 years as one of Boston's most active estate attorneys. In that time, I encountered a great many secrets belonging to a great many powerful people. I documented everything as is both professional practice and personal habit, and I kept those documents with the thoroughness you would expect from someone who understood from the beginning of his career that information properly preserved is the most durable form of protection available. I never used any of it. That would have been an abuse of the trust placed in me, and I was not that kind of attorney. But I kept it, and I kept it here where only you can access it now." The filing cabinets in this study contain 40 years of careful documentation. Some of it concerns powerful Boston families who believe their arrangements were private. Some of it concerns matters closer to home. There is a thick folder in the second cabinet clearly labeled containing everything I learned about Gordon's efforts to challenge our marriage in 2009, including the names of the attorneys he retained and the specific grounds they explored. There is documentation of Gordon's business dealings over the past 15 years that he would very much prefer remain private. Cecilia's financial arrangements during her 3 divorces were not entirely what the public record suggests, and I have the documentation to prove it. Barrett's company has maintained a structure for handling certain transactions that the IRS would find extremely interesting. I am not asking you to use any of this. I am asking you only to know that it exists and that it is yours. If my children accept the situation with grace and leave you in peace, you will never need to open those drawers again. But if they choose to pursue you through the courts, if they try to take this property or make your life difficult in any way, you will have what you need to make that choice a very expensive one for them." She put the letter down for a moment. She sat in Walter's chair in Walter's study in the house she had not known existed, and she looked at the filing cabinets around her, and she tried to hold all of it at once and found that she could not. The scale of it was too large. The planning was too extensive. 40 years of careful construction maintained in absolute secrecy for the sole purpose of arriving at this moment intact. She picked the letter back up. The final page was shorter than the others. The handwriting was the same, but the sentences were different, less structured, less attorney and more. Something else. Something she recognized from the gardenia left on the pillow every Valentine's Day. From the small things brought back from monthly trips she had not understood until now. "Dorothy," he had written, "I know I failed you in the ways that counted most while I was alive. I was not brave enough to stand up to my children's judgment publicly. I was not willing to endure the conflict that defending you openly would have required. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping the peace, but I know that was not entirely honest. I was protecting myself from a war I did not want to fight. And you paid the cost of that for 40 years in small and large ways that I understood clearly and did not adequately address. I cannot fix that now. I can only tell you this. There was never a single day of our 40 years in which you were not the most important person in my world. There was never a moment in this house, and I spent many moments here thinking of you, wishing I could bring you here. Carrying your photographs back from home to put on these walls, because I needed to see you when I was away from you, in which I was not aware that I had been luckier in love than I deserved, and less courageous about it than you deserved. This house is yours. This land is yours. This town has known your name for decades and has been waiting for you with the patience of people who trusted me when I told them you were worth waiting for. Live here or don't. Sell it or don't. Build something or simply rest. You have spent 40 years living a life organized entirely around someone else's needs and preferences in schedule and world. Whatever comes next belongs entirely to you. I am sorry I couldn't say this while I was breathing. I am telling you now in the way available to me. You were never the domestic help, Dorothy. You were never the secretary I kept around. You were the only real thing in a life that was otherwise almost entirely performance. I loved you in the only way I knew how, which was imperfectly and sometimes cowardly and always completely. All my love in whatever form love takes when it has nowhere left to go. Walter. Dorothy sat in the chair for a long time after she finished reading. The house was quiet around her. Through the door of the study, she could hear faintly Harlan Briggs moving in the kitchen, the sound of a kettle being filled, the particular domestic normalcy of someone who knows where things are kept. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the cream envelope. She set it on the desk. She looked at the filing cabinets for a moment, 4 of them, dark green metal, labeled in Walter's handwriting, containing 40 years of documented secrets, and then she stood up and opened the first one. Not the drawer containing the sensitive material, the first drawer at the top which held the property documents. The deed to 47 Ridgewood Lane and the surrounding acreage, her name on it, in the clear black ink of a document prepared in 1984 and notarized properly and filed correctly and maintained in this cabinet for 40 years. The trust documentation for the maintenance fund, thick and detailed and structured, with the thoroughness of someone who had anticipated every possible legal challenge to it. The assessment reports on the land, 2 of them both dated within the last 2 years, both arriving at figures in the same general range that Walter had described in his letter. She held the deed in her hands, and she looked at her name on it, and she understood for the first time what the last 40 years had actually been. Not what she had thought they were, not the story of a woman who had been accommodated and then discarded, but something else entirely. The story of a man who had spent 40 years building something in secret, maintaining it with obsessive care, and waiting for the moment when the gift could be delivered safely, when no legal challenge could undo it, when it would arrive complete and protected and entirely hers. The story of a man who had been a coward in every visible way and had compensated for that cowardice in the only invisible way available to him. She was not sure, sitting in that study with the deed in her hands, whether this was enough. She was not sure that secret devotion compensated fully for 40 years of public invisibility. She was not sure that a house and a letter and several filing cabinets of carefully preserved documentation balanced the ledger of what she had given and what she had received in 40 years of marriage. The calculus was more complicated than that, and she knew it, and she suspected that she would be working through it for a long time. But she also knew what it felt like to hold a deed with her name on it and understand that it had been there all along. She knew what it felt like to sit in a room full of photographs that someone had taken of her because they could not stop seeing her, could not stop wanting to look at her, had felt so compelled by the sight of her that they had brought the evidence of it here and covered the walls with it. She placed the deed back in the drawer, and she closed the cabinet, and she went into the kitchen. Harlan Briggs had made tea. He had found cups that matched, which suggested he knew where things were kept, which confirmed what he had said about nearly 40 years of neighboring. He set a cup in front of her, and he sat down across the table, and he said, "Well, how are you doing?" Dorothy said, "I genuinely don't know." He nodded as though this was the expected and appropriate answer. In the days that followed, Dorothy discovered that Harwick had been waiting for her in a way that was both more specific and more moving than she had been prepared for. Harlan introduced her to the town with the ease of someone performing introductions that had been anticipated for a long time. The pastor of the white church on Main Street, a quiet man named Reverend Gale in his 60s, who had known Walter for decades, told her that the complete roof replacement on the church building 3 years ago had been funded by a donor who had insisted on absolute anonymity. Everyone in Harwick had understood who that donor was, though they had honored his request and never said so publicly. An elderly woman named Mrs. Voss, who had lived in Harwick since before any of the current residents could remember, sat with Dorothy one afternoon in a kitchen that smelled of dried herbs and old wood, and told her that Walter had paid for her grandson's entire college tuition, set up as an anonymous scholarship through the County Educational Foundation. The boy was now a civil engineer working in Portland, the first person in 3 generations of her family to earn a university degree. She said this without particular drama, in the tone of someone reporting a fact that has long since become part of the settled landscape of her understanding of how things work. The young librarian at the building Dorothy had noticed on Main Street, a woman named Clara in her early 30s with a passionate and organized relationship to the town's reading material, explained that 5 years ago, the library's municipal budget had been cut to the point where closure seemed inevitable. Walter had appeared one afternoon with a check, not a pledge, not a commitment. An actual check sufficient to cover the immediate operating shortfall and establish a 20-year endowment that would make the library financially independent of the town budget going forward. He had asked only that his name not appear on anything, which Clara had honored, though the whole town knew. Walter Calloway had lived 2 lives for nearly 40 years. In Boston, he had been the prestigious attorney, the measured professional, the widowed father who had remarried and maintained a careful peace with children who resented his choices, the husband who had kept a significant part of himself permanently separate. Here in Harwick, he had been something different, more generous, more genuinely present, more himself in the way that people sometimes can only be in the places where no one is watching for failure or measuring them against an established image. Dorothy found herself thinking about this distinction constantly in those first days. Not with bitterness, though bitterness was available and not entirely unjustified, but with the particular complexity that comes from understanding a person more fully after they are gone than you ever managed to while they were present. Walter had given Harwick the version of himself he had not been able to give Boston. He had given Dorothy the evidence of that version, the photographs, and the house, and the letter, and the carefully maintained property, and the filing cabinets, and the 40 years of monthly presence in this small town, given her the truth of who he had been in this place, delivered in death, when he no longer had anything to protect by hiding it. She walked every morning in the woods surrounding the property, the old oaks enormous and quiet around her, the ground soft with decades of accumulated leaf fall. She slept without the particular sleeplessness that had visited her every night in the Beacon Hill townhouse during the 30 days. She ate meals at the kitchen table of the old fieldstone house, and she read in the evenings by the fireplace, and she opened the filing cabinets in the study, a drawer at a time, reading through the documents, teaching herself the language of what she had inherited, understanding more each day about the structure Walter had spent 4 decades building around her. It was on the 4th day that Harlan told her the other thing. He told it carefully, the way he told everything, without drama, without build-up. Simply as a fact she was entitled to know, offered at the moment he had judged she was ready to receive it. They were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee when he set down his cup and said, "There's something I should have told you sooner. I kept it back because the first days were enough to carry, and I didn't want to add more before you'd had time to settle. But you should know now." She said, "Tell me." 3 weeks before Dorothy had arrived in Harwick, Gordon had come. He had driven out to Ridgewood Lane in a vehicle that was too expensive and too low to the ground for the dirt road, and he had walked the perimeter of the property without going to the door, measuring it with his eyes the way a man measures something he is trying to figure out how to claim. Then he had driven into town and parked on Main Street and gone into the diner and sat at a table and asked questions about the house, about the owner of record, about whether there were liens, interested buyers, any pending legal complications, any reason a family member with a plausible claim might be able to establish an interest in the property. He had then, Harlan said, retained a local man, not quite a private investigator in any formal sense, more the kind of general-purpose problem solver that small rural communities sometimes produce, a man who knew everyone and could find out most things for a reasonable fee to research the property's ownership history and its current assessed value. The town had told him nothing. Not the diner, not the hardware store, not the post office, not the pastor, not Mrs. Voss, not the librarian. Walter had spoken to each of them individually over the years, and his instructions had been simple and direct. If anyone ever comes asking about this property or this house, before my wife arrives, you tell them nothing. Not because there is anything to hide, but because there are people who will use whatever they learn against her, and she needs to arrive here before they can act. They had honored this without question because Walter had given them reason enough over the years to trust his judgment in such matters. Gordon had left Harwick after 2 days, having concluded apparently that the property was exactly what Cecilia had described in Arthur Nolan's conference room, a collapsing structure of minimal value in an unremarkable rural location not worth the legal fees a challenge would require. Dorothy sat with this for a long moment. She looked at her hands on the kitchen table. She thought about Gordon standing on the dirt road in his expensive car, looking at the oaks and the clearing and the stone house, and calculating and walking away, believing he had seen the whole picture when he had seen almost none of it. She thought about a town full of people who had kept silent, not from obligation, but from genuine loyalty to a man who had given them reasons to be loyal. She said, he came here before me. He was already trying to understand what he could claim. Harlan said yes. She said, and the entire town kept silent. He said, Walter asked us to. He explained why years ago, long before it was necessary. He said there were people who would come looking if they ever found out this place existed, and that the best protection was complete ignorance on their part. We trusted him. We trust you. Dorothy looked out the kitchen window at the clearing and the oaks and the fountain in the center of the wild garden. She thought about the word trust, about what it meant to a town that had kept a man's secret for nearly 40 years because he had asked them to and they had believed he had good reason, about what it meant that she was the reason he had asked. She said he planned for that too, for Gordon coming to look. Harlan said Walter planned for everything. He was meticulous about it. Every time he came out here, he'd say, the only thing that worries me is the thing I haven't anticipated yet. And then he'd sit there and think for a while, and eventually he'd say something like, and here's what I'm going to do about that. Dorothy almost smiled at this. She recognized it. It was entirely, completely Walter. She was in the kitchen the following Thursday morning reading through the trust documentation for the third time because there were things in it she had not fully understood the first 2 times when her phone rang. Arthur Nolan's name appeared on the screen. She answered. He said, Dorothy, I hope you're settling in. I wanted to call because Gordon reached out to my office yesterday. He's retained a litigation firm, not his usual attorney, a firm that specializes in estate challenges. He's filing a motion in probate court to have the Ridgewood property reclassified as a marital asset. His argument is that any property acquired during the marriage, regardless of how it was titled or structured, should be subject to equitable distribution under Massachusetts law. Dorothy said, when did he file? Arthur said the motion was filed this morning. I've already pulled together the 1984 deed and the gift documentation and the trust structure. The legal position is extremely strong, Dorothy. Walter was meticulous, but Gordon's firm is aggressive, and they may try to delay this through procedural challenges even if the substantive law doesn't support their position. It could take months before it's fully resolved. Dorothy said, Arthur, there's a folder in the filing cabinet in the study here. It's labeled Gordon. Walter told me about it in the letter. Have you seen what's in it? A brief silence on the other end of the line. Then I helped Walter compile parts of it over the years. I know generally what's in it. Dorothy said if Gordon pushes this through the courts, is that folder sufficient to make the litigation unattractive to him? Another silence, slightly longer. Arthur Nolan said carefully it would make continuing the litigation extraordinarily unattractive for him. Let me put it that way. Dorothy thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment at the kitchen table with the trust documentation in front of her and the sound of the March wind in the oaks outside the window. She had known somewhere beneath the grief and the shock of the past weeks that Gordon would not accept the situation. Gordon had never in his life accepted a situation that did not confirm his own primacy in the existence of a property that Dorothy controlled entirely. A property worth several times what any of them had imagined was not something he could file away and move past. She had known it was coming. She had not known exactly when. She went to the study and she opened the second filing cabinet. The folder labeled Gordon Calloway was thick, several inches of carefully organized documents in chronological order. She began to read. It took her 2 hours to go through it completely. When she was done, she sat in Walter's chair, and she understood several things she had not understood before. She understood why Walter had started building this particular archive in 2009, the year Gordon had retained an attorney to explore challenging their marriage. She understood the specific legal strategies Gordon had explored in that year, the specific attorneys he had retained, the specific grounds they had identified and ultimately decided were insufficient to pursue. She understood a series of business transactions Gordon had conducted over the following decade that had been structured in ways that were creative in the legal sense, the sense that means something else entirely. She understood the dimensions of Gordon's exposure if any of this became a matter of public record. She understood that Walter had known all of this, had documented it with the patience of someone who was not planning to use it as a weapon, but was planning to ensure that the person it concerned understood that it existed, that it was preserved, and that someone who loved it even less than Walter did now held the key. She put the folder back in the cabinet and she sat with the information for a while thinking about how to use it, or whether to use it, whether to wait. She decided to wait, but not for long. She was standing at the kitchen window on a Tuesday morning, watching the light move through the bare oaks in the particular way it did on clear, cold days, when the angle was low and the shadows were long, when she heard a vehicle on the dirt road. Then two vehicles. She watched through the window as a black Escalade came into the clearing, followed by a second car she did not recognize. The Escalade stopped and the doors opened and Gordon stepped out, and then Cecilia and then Barrett. They stood in the clearing in front of the Fieldstone house, and they looked at it, and even from the kitchen window, Dorothy could see the moment when their faces shifted. The moment the story they had told themselves about this property. The story about the falling down house, worth $50,000 in the middle of nowhere. The story that had allowed them to feel generous in leaving it to her, encountered the actual house and began to come apart. Gordon looked at the house for a long time. He looked at the grounds, the formal gardens, the oaks, the size of the clearing, and the density of the forest beyond it. And Dorothy could see him doing the same calculations she had done, arriving at the same figures, and arriving at them with an expression that was not grief or regret, but something colder and more focused. He turned and said something to Cecilia. Cecilia nodded once sharply, the nod of someone confirming a plan that has already been made. Barrett stood slightly apart from them, looking at the house with an expression Dorothy could not fully read from this distance. He looked less certain than his siblings. He always had, she thought. He had always been the one who followed rather than led, which did not make him innocent, but it made him something different from Gordon and Cecilia. It made him someone who might, under the right circumstances, be capable of reconsidering. Dorothy took a breath. She straightened. She turned away from the window and she put the kettle on the stove because she was going to need to offer them something, and the small formality of tea in this situation was not hospitality. It was a statement about who was in control of this house and this kitchen and this moment. She heard their footsteps on the stone path. She heard them on the portico. She heard the knock at the heavy oak door. She let it knock twice before she went to answer it. Gordon stood in the doorway, and behind him Cecilia and Barrett, and they looked at her, and she looked at them, and in the first second of that exchange, Dorothy understood something that 40 years of living alongside these people had not taught her as clearly as this moment did. They had expected to find someone broken, someone diminished by the past weeks, frightened by the isolation, grateful for their attention. Someone who would negotiate from weakness because weakness was all she had been in their understanding of her for 4 decades. She stepped back from the door in a way that was clearly an invitation rather than a retreat. She said, Please come in. I've just put the kettle on." They came in. She watched their faces as they crossed the threshold, and the interior of the house registered the warmth, the quality of the furniture, the bookshelves, and then one by one the photographs. She watched Gordon's eyes move across the walls, and she watched him understand slowly what he was looking at. All the photographs of Dorothy. 40 years of Dorothy. His father's secret shrine to a woman Gordon had spent 40 years treating as peripheral as temporary, as someone occupying space that belonged by rights to the blood family. Something crossed Gordon's face that was gone before it fully formed. Then it was replaced by the expression he had worn at the will, reading controlled and prepared and certain of his position. He said, "We need to talk about the property situation, Dot." She said, "Of course. Sit down." And it's Dorothy. She served them tea in the best cups she had found in the cabinet, and she sat across from them at the kitchen table, and she was entirely composed, entirely still, and she watched them understand that she was not what they had come expecting to find. And she watched that understanding change the temperature of the room by several degrees. Gordon cleared his throat and opened the folder he had brought with him and began to speak about marital assets and equitable distribution and the legal arguments his firm had identified as the most promising avenue for reconsideration of the estate settlement. He used the word reasonable several times in the way that people use the word reasonable when they mean compliant. He said they weren't asking for everything they just wanted, what was fair, what the law actually entitled them to. What any objective reading of the situation would suggest was the appropriate outcome. Dorothy let him finish. She had learned this from 40 years of being in rooms where other people controlled the conversation. Let them finish. The person who speaks last often speaks from the stronger position. When Gordon was done, she stood up from the table. She walked to the study and she came back with the folder labeled Gordon Calloway, and she set it on the kitchen table between them. Then she went back to the study and came back with the folder labeled Cecilia Calloway Reed and set it beside the first. Then the folder labeled Barrett Calloway. She sat down. She said, "Your father spent 50 years as one of Boston's most active estate attorneys. He documented everything he learned about everyone. That was his professional habit, and he maintained it here in this study in those filing cabinets. The folders in front of you contain documentation of a number of things that I think you'll recognize when you look at them. Gordon, yours goes back to 2009, which I think you'll remember as a significant year in terms of certain decisions you made about my marriage to your father." Gordon's face had gone to a color that was not quite any natural color Dorothy could name. She continued, her voice the same steady register it had been since she opened the door. She said, "Your father never used any of this. He was not that kind of man, and I am trying not to be that kind of woman. I have no interest in damaging any of you. I have no interest in conflict. I have spent 40 years avoiding conflict, and I was wrong to do so for much of that time. But in this particular case, the avoidance I'm offering you is genuinely generous, not fearful. I am offering you the ability to walk away from this with your businesses and your finances and your reputations entirely intact." She looked at Gordon. She looked at Cecilia. She looked at Barrett, who had not spoken, and who was looking at the folder with his name on it, with an expression that contained something she thought might be a species of relief. The relief of someone who has been waiting for an authority they could not quite name to make a decision on their behalf. She said, "Your father left you exactly what he wanted you to have. The property here is mine. It was deeded to me in 1984, and the documentation in your own attorney's hands will make that clear when the motion is heard. Pursuing it through the courts will be expensive, slow, and ultimately unsuccessful. It will also create the conditions under which the contents of those folders become relevant to a number of other conversations. None of us want that. So I'm asking you, directly and without pretense, let this go. Accept what your father left you and leave me here in peace." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the windows, the oaks moved slightly in the wind, their bare branches making a sound like paper being carefully folded and unfolded. Cecilia was looking at the folder with her name on it. Something in her face moved beneath the composed surface, a movement that Dorothy recognized from having watched it happen on other faces in other difficult rooms. Not anger and not capitulation, but something more fundamental, something that had been compressed for a very long time, and was finding in this specific moment the pressure too great to maintain. Cecilia said very quietly, "He was never really there for us either, even before you. He was always working, always somewhere else in his head, even when he was in the same room. You didn't take him from us. We never fully had him to begin with." Dorothy looked at her for a moment. She looked at the folder with Cecilia's name on it, and she looked at the photographs on the walls visible through the kitchen doorway, and she thought about a man who had given this small town the version of himself that his own children had apparently never received. And she thought about what that cost and who had paid it. She said, "I know, that's a real loss and I won't minimize it, but it doesn't change what's mine." Cecilia held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, and it was not quite defeat, but it was the end of something. Gordon had not spoken since Dorothy set the folders on the table. He sat with his hands flat on the surface in the posture of a man working through an internal calculation and finding that the numbers are not coming out in his favor. He was a smart man. That was part of what made him dangerous. And it was also in this moment what made him manageable. Smart people can do the math when the math is clearly and completely laid out for them. He said finally, without looking up, "What are your terms?" Dorothy said, "I already told you. You dropped the legal challenge. All of you. You accept the will as written and you leave me alone here. That's all I'm asking. No contact, no challenges, no further attempts to reclassify anything. In exchange, those folders stay in the cabinet and the contents remain between us." Gordon said, "And if we don't agree?" She said, "Then we all find out together what a thorough estate attorney can accomplish when he's had 50 years to be thorough." Another silence, the longest of the morning. Gordon closed his folder. He stood up from the table. He looked at his siblings in the particular way that older siblings look at younger ones when a decision has been made, and the only remaining question is whether the others can be dignified about accepting it. Cecilia stood. Barrett stood, and Dorothy noticed that the expression on his face now was not the expression he had arrived with. Something in it was lighter, as though a tension he had been carrying had been released, and he had not yet decided how to understand the absence of it. Gordon looked at Dorothy. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. He said, "We'll be in touch with Arthur Nolan's office about withdrawing the motion." She said, "I'd appreciate that. Drive safely. The road gets rough before it reaches the pavement." She walked them to the door. She stood on the portico and she watched them get into the black Escalade. And she watched the Escalade move slowly across the clearing and back into the track through the oaks and disappear into the forest, the sound of its engine fading until the clearing was simply quiet again, the way it had been when she arrived. She went inside. She put the 3 folders back in their cabinets in the study. She closed the drawers. She turned off the banker's lamp and she closed the study door and she walked to the kitchen and she made herself a fresh cup of tea and she sat at the table by the window and she watched the afternoon light move through the oaks and change the color of the clearing by degrees as the sun lowered, and she held the warm cup in both hands, and she was, for the first time in as long as she could accurately remember, simply present in her own life without performing anything for anyone at all. Her phone rang once an hour later. "Arthur Nolan." She answered and he said, "Only Gordon's attorney just called. They're withdrawing the motion." She said, "I know." He said, "Are you all right, Dorothy?" She looked out the window at the oaks and the clearing and the wild garden with its dry fountain and its untrained roses in the particular quality of the late afternoon light in western Massachusetts in March. The light that was almost something she could touch. She said, "Yes, Arthur, I think I actually am." The morning after they left, Dorothy woke before the sun. She lay in the upstairs bedroom of the Fieldstone house, and she listened to the particular silence of a place that exists far enough from roads and other people that nighttime is genuinely quiet. Not the reduced urban noise that passes for quiet in a city, but actual silence. The kind that has texture that you can feel against your skin the same way you feel cold air against it. She had slept through the night without waking, which had not happened once during the 30 days she spent in the Beacon Hill townhouse, being made invisible in her own home. She had slept the way people sleep when they are no longer afraid of what the next morning will require of them. She got up and went to the window. The clearing was gray and still in the pre-dawn. the oaks standing at its edges in their winter silhouettes, their bare branches holding the last of the night against the sky. The wild garden was a collection of shapes and shadows, the dry fountain at its center, a dark form she could make out only by knowing it was there. The air outside the glass was cold, and she could see her breath in the room, which was heated, but not to the degree that the Beacon Hill townhouse had been heated, not to the aggressive warmth of a house whose occupants considered high heat a baseline comfort they were owed. She found that she preferred this. The edge of cold in the morning, the need for the sweater she had left on the chair by the bed, the particular quality of light that came with genuine darkness, giving way to genuine dawn, rather than the always partially illuminated sky of a city where the night is never completely dark. She dressed and she went downstairs and she made coffee in the kitchen and she stood at the window above the farmhouse sink and she watched the clearing go from gray to silver to the pale gold of early morning light coming through bare branches, and she allowed herself to simply stand there and watch it without organizing the watching into anything useful. She refilled her coffee and she went to the study. She was not going to the filing cabinets. She had already read what she needed to read, had already used what needed to be used, and the rest of it could remain where it was documented and preserved and available if it was ever needed again, which she genuinely hoped it would not be. She went to the study for the desk, for the chair. She sat in Walter's chair at Walter's desk, and she turned on the banker's lamp, and she put her coffee on the leather surface, and she opened the top drawer of the desk, the shallow center drawer that she had not yet fully gone through. It held the things that desks of this kind always hold. A letter opener, a spare pen, a small notebook with some of Walter's handwriting in it that she set aside to read later, a roll of stamps, a few rubber bands, a paperclip, and at the very back of the drawer, pushed against the wood of the rear panel, in a way that suggested it had been placed rather than forgotten, a small envelope. Smaller than the cream envelope with the letter. Business envelope sized white, sealed with the same dark red wax, and on the front in Walter's handwriting, for Dorothy's future. Open when ready. She held it for a moment. She thought about the word ready and what it meant and whether she was it. She had arrived at this house less than 2 weeks ago with 3 suitcases and 2 boxes and a chipped ceramic mug, and the remnant of a life she was still in the process of understanding had been built on a foundation more complicated and more solid than she had been permitted to see. She had confronted Gordon in her own kitchen and watched him make the calculation that reasonable men make when their options are clearly laid before them. She had watched Cecilia's composure crack at the seam of something genuine. She had watched Barrett stand slightly apart and look relieved. She broke the seal. Inside was a folded document in a smaller piece of paper, a single sheet, the same expensive stationery as the letter handwritten in the same precise hand. She read the smaller piece first. Walter had written, "By the time you're opening this, you'll have found your footing. I know you, Dorothy, and I know that finding your footing is something you do with a thoroughness that eventually surprises even you. This is the last thing I have to give you. Not the last because I ran out of things to give, but the last because everything that follows from here belongs entirely to your own invention. I have provided the materials. The building is yours to design." She unfolded the document. It was a deed. 20 acres on the eastern edge of Harwick, adjacent to the town proper, a parcel she had not yet seen, but whose general location she could work out from the description in the legal text. The deed bore her name, Dorothy Ann Calloway, sole owner, transferred and notarized the previous year. There was a second document behind it, a trust instrument, not the maintenance trust for the Ridgewood property, but a separate fund, separately held, separately capitalized. The purpose line of the trust read, "For any projects, endeavors, or purposes Dorothy Calloway chooses to pursue." The capitalization was $500,000. The trustee was Arthur Nolan. The terms gave Dorothy complete discretion over its use, subject to no conditions, no evaluations, no requirements, except that she be the one who decided what it was for. She sat with these documents for a long time. $500,000 and 20 acres of land in a town where she was beginning slowly and carefully to belong. No instructions, no parameters. only the invitation delivered in Walter's careful handwriting to build something. She folded the documents and returned them to the envelope, and she sat in the chair and she let herself imagine it for the first time. Really imagine it, without shutting the thought down as too large or too uncertain, without restricting herself to the practical requirements of survival that had occupied all of her mental space since the morning she had found him with his coffee going cold on the nightstand. She let herself think about what she might build, what she might make with 20 acres and $500,000 in the particular knowledge she had accumulated over 68 years of being a woman who had made herself useful to other people's lives and had now arrived unexpectedly and completely at a life of her own. She was still thinking about it when she heard Harlan Briggs' truck on the dirt road. He knocked at the door with his customary two knocks, not the performative knock of someone announcing an intrusion, but the practical knock of someone who has decided that a certain number of knocks constitutes adequate notice and has no interest in exceeding it. She called from the study, and he let himself in because she had told him 3 days ago that he could let himself in, and neither of them had seen the point of maintaining a formality that served no practical purpose. He appeared in the study doorway with a paper bag and said Eleanor from the diner sent this. Apple muffins. She said you looked thin when she saw you on Tuesday, which I'd take with some skepticism because Eleanor says that about everyone she likes. Dorothy said, tell Eleanor I'm grateful. He set the bag on the desk and he looked at the envelope with the broken seal, and he said nothing, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate most specifically about Harlan Briggs in the 2 weeks she had known him. He understood the difference between the moment to speak and the moment to be present without speaking, and he had developed a reliable instinct for which was which. It was a quality she had encountered in very few people over the course of her life, and she had always found it in the people who possessed it, a kind of intelligence that did not get sufficient credit from the world. She said he left me 20 acres and $500,000 with no instructions. Harlan said sounds exactly like Walter. She said it does, rather. He looked at the window for a moment at the clearing and the oaks in the morning light. Then he said, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. I kept putting it off because I wanted you to be ready for it, and I think now you probably are. She said, tell me. He said for the past 40 years, every donation Walter made in Harwick, the church roof, the library endowment, Mrs. Voss's grandson's scholarship, the new wing on the community center, the equipment for the volunteer fire department, all of it, he put them all in someone else's name, not his own. He never wanted his name on any of it. Dorothy said, I know. Everyone told me that. Harlan said what they didn't tell you because I asked them not to until I thought you were ready to hear it is whose name he put them in. She looked at him. He said every single donation Walter made to this town for 40 years is registered in the name of Dorothy Ann Calloway. The church records show it. The library endowment papers show it. The scholarship fund documentation. All of it. He wrote your name on every check. He filed every deed of gift in your name. He told me once years ago that the money was his, but the generosity belonged to you, that the impulse to give came from learning to see clearly by loving you. This entire town has known the name Dorothy Calloway for 40 years as the person who built what we have here. The study was very quiet. Dorothy said he gave me the credit. Harlan said he gave you the credit for every single thing he did here. Said he was just administering resources. Said the generosity was yours. She sat with this for a long time in the chair in the small study, with the photographs of herself on the walls of the rooms beyond, and the filing cabinets containing 40 years of careful protection, and the new envelope with 20 acres and $500,000 and no instructions. And she sat with the understanding of a man who had put her name on every good thing he had done in the place he came to be his truest self. She said, that is the most complicated thing anyone has ever done for me. Harlan said yes. He was a complicated man. She said you liked him. He said I did. He wasn't simple to like. But yes, I liked him very much. She set her coffee cup on the desk and she said, I want to see the 20 acres. He said I was hoping you'd say that. I've got the truck. They drove the eastern boundary of the property that morning. Harlan's truck moving slowly along the edge where Harwick's roads gave way to cleared land, giving way to a stand of younger trees, maples mostly, and beyond them a meadow that the March cold had rendered the pale gold of dormant grass, but that she could see even now would be something else entirely in another 2 months when the ground thawed and the season changed. The parcel was flat in places and gently rolling in others, and at its northern edge it backed against a line of old stone walls, the kind that New England fields accumulate over centuries of clearing and use. And there was a small barn, red-painted, well-maintained, its doors closed against the winter, and beside it a cottage also well-maintained, simple white clapboard with a covered porch facing south toward the meadow. Dorothy got out of the truck and she walked across the meadow to the cottage, and she stood on the porch and she looked south across the land, and she could see in the middle distance the beginning of the oaks that marked the edge of the Ridgewood property. She was looking at her own land from her other land, which struck her as something that would have been entirely unimaginable 2 weeks ago and was now simply factually true. She stood on the porch of the cottage and she thought about what it wanted to be. Not what Walter had imagined for it. The note had been explicit that he was not providing parameters. But what she imagined for it. What she, Dorothy Calloway, who had spent 40 years making other people's lives run smoothly without needing recognition, who had arrived at this place with 3 suitcases and a chip mug, and was now standing on land that was hers, in every available sense, actually imagined. She thought about the women who did not have what she had, who arrived at 65 or 68 or 70 with nothing, because there had been no one building a fortress in the background, who arrived with the same fear she had felt in the parking garage of Arthur Nolan's building, the fear of having nothing left to lose, of having the rest of their life amount to diminishment rather than continuation. Who needed somewhere to land while they figured out what came next, and had no idea where to look for such a place. She thought about what this could be for those women. A place to come, a place to stay for a while, a place to rest and think and figure out the next thing, surrounded by people who genuinely saw them, in a town that understood how to keep faith with the people who mattered to it. She turned around and looked at the barn. She walked to it and she opened the doors and she stood in the opening and she looked at the interior. Clean dry, the wood dark with age but solid throughout. Large enough for gatherings. High enough in the ceiling to feel generous without being wasteful. The afternoon light fell through the east windows in long bars across the plank floor, and she thought a meeting space. A place for the conversations that need room to happen. The ones that don't fit inside a cottage room or a kitchen table. She stood in the barn doorway for a long time. Harlan waited by the truck without suggesting she hurry. Eventually, she walked back to the truck and she said, "I know what I want to do with it." He said, "I thought you might." She said, "I'll need your help." He said, "I know. That's why I'm here." The months that followed had the quality that comes when a person begins to move in the direction they were always meant to move. Not the quality of ease exactly, because nothing that genuinely matters comes easily, but the quality of appropriate difficulty. The difficulty of work that is proportionate to the person doing it, and that reveals capacity rather than consuming it. Dorothy found in those months capacities she had not previously been able to measure because she had never previously been in a situation that required them or permitted them. By April, 6 weeks after the Escalade had turned around in the clearing and disappeared into the oaks, the barn renovation was underway, and Dorothy had learned the names of every person on Main Street and the habits of both tables in the diner. She worked with Arthur Nolan to establish the legal structure for what she was building, a nonprofit organization properly incorporated, with a board that included Harlan and Clara the librarian and Reverend Gale and 2 women from neighboring towns who had experience running organizations of this kind. She worked with a local contractor named Diane, a woman in her 50s who had renovated half of Harwick over the past decade, and who approached the cottage and barn project with a practical intelligence Dorothy found immediately trustworthy. She planted the Ridgewood garden herself, or rather she began planting it, understanding that a garden of this scope is not a project that admits of completion, only of continuation. She cleared the beds that Walter had let go wild, and she worked the soil, and she put in the roses first because roses were where she always started, and then the perennials she had learned over 37 years in the Beacon Hill garden, the ones that returned reliably year after year and form the skeleton of something permanent. She ordered bulbs and bare root plants from a nursery in Vermont, and she planted them in the cold ground of early April with the faith that is required to put things in the earth before you can see any evidence that they will become anything. She was in the diner on a Tuesday morning in late April at her regular table, going through renovation plans for the barn with Diane, when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. The voice on the other end was a woman's, measured and professional. She introduced herself as the director of a conservation organization based in Western Massachusetts and explained that she had been in correspondence with Walter Calloway for several years about the possibility of acquiring the woodland acreage surrounding the Ridgewood property. She had recently learned through local contacts that the ownership had changed and wondered if the conversation might continue under the new circumstances. Dorothy set down her coffee cup. She said, "How much of the acreage are you interested in?" The director said, "Ideally the full 247 acres. We've had two independent assessments done, both arriving at figures between 3 million and 3.4 million. We're prepared to offer 3.2, which reflects fair market value at the upper end of those assessments." Dorothy said, "What would happen to the land?" The director said, "Protected conservation in perpetuity. No development, no extraction, no alteration of the existing ecosystem. The house and the immediately surrounding cleared area, roughly 3 acres, would remain in private ownership. We would acquire only the woodland." Dorothy looked out the window at Main Street in the thin spring sunshine. She thought about the oaks, about the way the road through them felt the canopy closing overhead, the light coming through in patterns that moved. She thought about what Walter had written, "Sell it or don't. The decision is entirely yours." She said, "Let me think about it." She called Arthur Nolan from the diner parking lot. He said he would review the terms. She said, "Arthur, one condition, non-negotiable, regardless of what else is agreed. The conservation deed should record the land as protected in the name of Walter and Dorothy Calloway jointly." A pause. Then Arthur said, "I think that's a beautiful condition, Dorothy. I'll make sure it's in the language." The sale was finalized at the end of May. On the morning the documents were signed, Dorothy drove out to Ridgewood Road and parked the car and walked into the oaks. Not all the way to the house, just into the trees far enough that she could not see the road behind her or the clearing ahead. Only the oaks and the sky between their branches, the light of late May coming through new leaves in the soft green that early summer makes, when the leaves are still thin enough to be translucent. She stood in that light for a long time. She thought about the man who had driven out here every month for 40 years. She thought about what these trees had given him that his Boston life could not. She thought, "I understand it now." She walked back to the car. Cecilia called in early June. Dorothy was in the barn reviewing renovation progress with Diane when the call came through. She stepped outside into the June warmth to answer it. Cecilia said, "Gordon has formally withdrawn the motion. Arthur's office should have the paperwork already." Dorothy said, "I know. Arthur told me in April." A brief silence. Then Cecilia said, "I also wanted to tell you something. Not to ask for anything, I want to be clear about that. But I've been thinking about what you said at the house, about the 40 years. Dorothy said nothing and let her continue. "Cecilia said I was unfair to you. For a very long time. I knew it even while I was doing it. I was angry at Dad for things that had nothing to do with you, and you were a more available target than he was. That's not an excuse. I just wanted you to know that I see it now more clearly than I did." Dorothy said, "I appreciate that, Cecilia." Cecilia said, "The Beacon Hill house is more complicated than we expected. The preservation requirements are significant. The mortgage is more than we realized." Dorothy said, "Yes, I imagine it is." Another silence. Then Cecilia said, "He planned all of it, didn't he? Every piece of it." Dorothy said, "He was an estate attorney for 50 years. He planned everything." Cecilia said, "Were you angry when you found out Dorothy thought about this honestly?" She said, "I was many things. Angry was one of them. It isn't the thing I am most now." Cecilia said, "What are you most now?" Dorothy looked out at the meadow from the barn doorway, the June grass tall and moving in a light wind, the stone walls at the northern edge of the property, gray and permanent, covered in places with the bright new green of climbing things beginning their season. She said, "I'm busy. I have a great deal to do." Cecilia made a sound that might have been a small, surprised laugh. She said, "That's good, I think." Dorothy said, "I think so too." The barn renovation was completed in July. The contractor had opened the east wall to a row of tall windows that brought the meadow inside in the way that good architecture makes the landscape continuous with the interior rather than separate from it. The original wood had been cleaned and preserved rather than replaced, so the barn kept its age and its character while becoming genuinely functional. There were chairs enough for 40 people arranged around tables sized for working conversations. There was a kitchen at one end, simple and sufficient. There was a wall of shelving that Dorothy filled with books she ordered from Claire's recommendations books about the specific territories that women navigating major life transitions needed to understand and did not always know how to find. The cottage renovation was finished in August. 6 rooms, each small and simply furnished, the furnishing of rooms intended for function rather than impression, for people who need rest more than aesthetics. Each room had a window looking toward the meadow or the stone walls or the stand of maples at the property's edge. Each had a chair good enough to sit in for several hours and a reading lamp positioned correctly for reading. Dorothy named the organization Ridgewood House. She had considered incorporating Walter's name and had decided against it, not from bitterness, which had not survived contact with the evidence she had found in the Fieldstone house, but because the thing she was building was not a monument to anyone. It was a place, a working place organized around what the women who came to it needed rather than around who had made it possible. Walter had made it possible, and she was grateful for that, in the complicated, clear-eyed way she had learned to be grateful for complicated things. But Ridgewood House was hers, and its name would reflect that. The first women arrived in September. There were 4 of them that first month, referred through networks that Harlan and Arthur and the board had spent the summer building, social workers in Boston and Springfield, who worked with women navigating divorce or widowhood or the particular aftermath of having spent decades in lives organized entirely around other people's needs. The 4 women who came in September were between 58 and 73 years old. They were each in the middle of something difficult, and each in the particular state of not knowing what came next, which is a state that has its own texture and its own weight and its own specific requirements. Dorothy did not run Ridgewood House as a therapist or a counselor. She ran it as someone who had been in the room they were currently in and had found the door, which was a different qualification, and in some ways a more useful one. She made meals with them in the cottage kitchen. She walked the meadow with them in the mornings. She sat in the barn in the afternoons when the conversations wanted to happen, and she listened more than she spoke. And when she spoke, she said what she actually thought, rather than what she believed would be comforting, because she had found that honest thought was almost always more useful than organized comfort, and that people in genuine difficulty are rarely served by being soothed. She told them when they asked how she had arrived here, "I was given 40 years of someone's love in a form I couldn't see until after they were gone. That taught me something about looking for what is actually there rather than the form you expected it to take." She told them, "I was 68 years old when I started over. There is no magic in any particular age. There is only what you do with what you have when you finally have it." She told them on the evening of the first week, sitting in the barn with the September light going gold outside the tall east windows, "The hardest thing I have ever done was let go of the idea that I was the person I had been performing for 40 years. Because when you let go of that, you have to find out who you actually are underneath all the performance. And that is genuinely terrifying. But it is also the only genuinely interesting thing I have done in my entire life." October came to Harwick with the completeness that fall comes to New England. The maples on the 20 acres going orange and red in the sequence that maple leaves follow the oaks, holding their color longest, the meadowgrass becoming the color of old honey. Dorothy walked the boundary of the property every morning, a habit she had no intention of abandoning, a way of knowing the land that required only her own feet, and the particular attention that walking in the same place repeatedly develops over time. She was on the east side of the property one morning in mid-October, following the line of the old stone wall, when she found a section that had partially collapsed, a dozen or so stones fallen from the top of the wall into the meadow on one side and the woodland on the other. She stood and looked at the fallen stones, and she thought about what rebuilding required, lifting each stone, understanding its particular shape, finding where it had come from in the wall structure, and returning it or finding a new position suited to its character. The patience of the work, the specificity of it, the way it rewarded attention and penalized rushing. She started with the largest stone. She worked for 2 hours, moving slowly, learning as she went what the wall needed and what each stone could do, making mistakes and correcting them, finding the rhythm of it gradually, the way you find the rhythm of any work that rewards sustained attention. By noon, the section was repaired solid and level, looking as though it had always been that way. She stood back and looked at what she had done, and she understood something clearly that she had been understanding slowly for months. That is the work. That is what all of it is. You find the part that has come apart, and you learn its shape, and you put it back together stone by stone in the order that the structure requires, and you don't rush it, and you don't skip the difficult pieces, and you accept that the work will cost you something, and that the cost is part of what makes it worth doing. She walked back across the meadow toward the cottage, where the 4 women from September were eating lunch on the porch in the October sun, their voices carrying across the field as a sound, rather than as words, the particular sound of people talking, with the ease that comes when they are no longer performing ease, when ease has simply become actual. Arthur Nolan called that afternoon. He said, "I wanted to give you a final update on the Beacon Hill situation. The Preservation Committee completed their review last week. The renovation restrictions are significant. The exterior cannot be altered. The interior structural elements are protected. The back garden is classified as a historic landscape. Gordon retained a specialist to assess the compliance costs before any sale can be listed. The number came back at $460,000 in required remediation work." Dorothy said, "In the mortgage." Arthur said the remaining balance is $1.1 million. When they sell, assuming the market cooperates, they'll clear something in the range of $500,000 to $600,000 after the mortgage, and the remediation costs split 3 ways, which is a different figure from what they anticipated. Dorothy said, "Yes, it is." Arthur said the trusts are proceeding exactly as Walter designed them. Gordon is finding the annual character evaluation considerably more demanding than he anticipated. Barrett's investment fund has performed adequately under his own management, which I'm told surprised him in a way that may prove useful to him going forward. Cecilia is working through the family relationship requirements with what I'm told is more genuine effort than anyone expected of her. Dorothy said that's something. Arthur said Walter would have thought so, I believe. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Arthur, do you think he knew specifically what they would do? Whether Gordon would file the motion, whether they would come to Harwick?" Arthur said Walter understood his children very well. He had spent 50 years understanding what people do when they believe they are entitled to something. He knew Gordon would push as far as the situation permitted. He prepared for exactly that. She said, "And you helped him prepare." He said for 20 years, he was meticulous. "I've never had a client who prepared anything with that level of thoroughness and consistency over that length of time." She said he should have been braver. While he was alive, Arthur said yes, he should have been. He knew that, Dorothy. The letter was his acknowledgement of it, the clearest one he was capable of making. She said, "I know." She sat with the phone after she hung up, and she looked out at the meadow going amber in the late afternoon, the October light doing to the landscape what October light does, making everything slightly more itself, slightly more vivid, and slightly more finite simultaneously. The 4 women had gone inside, and she could see the cottage windows lit from within, warm and specific against the darkening sky. She sat on the porch of the cottage, and she let the evening come around her. Harlan arrived at his customary time, which was whenever he felt like it, which was usually around this hour, having closed the store and driven the 2 miles out in his truck with whatever the day had given him to bring. Tonight it was a paper bag from the diner, Eleanor's chicken soup, he said, because the nights were cold now, and soup was the reasonable response to cold evenings. and he sat in the other chair on the porch with his own coffee, and he did not say anything immediately, which was the thing she valued most specifically and consistently about Harlan Briggs. He understood that silence between people who have become genuinely comfortable with each other is not a problem requiring a solution. She thought about Gordon and Cecilia and Barrett somewhere in Boston with their complicated trusts and their preservation requirements and their annual evaluations working out the consequences of a plan they had never seen coming. She did not feel triumph about this. She had expected to, perhaps had wanted to, during the worst of the 30 days she had spent in the Beacon Hill house, being made invisible. But what she actually felt was something closer to the absence of a weight she had been carrying for so long. She had stopped noticing its presence until it was gone. The particular quality of space that opens up when something you have been carrying for a very long time is finally permanently set down. She looked at the meadow going dark and the maples at the edge holding their last red in the failing light, and the stone walls gray and solid at the property's boundary, and the barn with its tall east windows, and the cottage warm behind her, and the road beyond it leading to Harwick, where the diner and the library and the hardware store and the white church were going about their evening in the way of small towns that have endured long enough to understand that endurance is itself a kind of accomplishment. She thought about the photographs on the walls of the Ridgewood house. She had not removed them. She had decided early that she would not, that they belonged to the house the way the stone and the oak floors and the fireplace belonged to it, that a house with 40 years of love documented on its walls should not have that documentation replaced by someone else's sense of what looks current. But she had added to them her own choices, her own things alongside his. A photograph her mother had taken of her at 22, standing in a summer garden squinting into the sun, with an expression she recognized now as the face of someone not yet aware of needing to manage how they appeared. A print she had found in the Harwick Library's small gallery, a painting of the meadow in early morning fog, made by someone who understood what that particular light required. Several photographs she had taken herself in the months since arriving the clearing in snow. The oaks in May with their new leaves, the barn's east windows with the summer meadow visible beyond them. Her photographs and Walter's photographs side by side on the fieldstone walls, which seemed right to her, which seemed like the truest record of what the house had actually contained across 40 years and what it contained now. Harlan said eventually, "How are the women doing?" She said, "Well, I think. It's still early. The first weeks are hard for everyone." He said, "You were hard in the first weeks." She said, "I was terrified in the first weeks." He said, "Same thing sometimes." She considered this. She said, "I suppose so." He said, "You're not terrified now." She said, "No, I'm not." He looked out at the meadow and he said, "Walter used to sit out here in the evenings when he came. Just sit sometimes for an hour or more." He said it was the only place in his life where he could hear himself think without all the other noise getting in the way. She said, "I understand that now, better than I expected to." He said he used to say he wished he could bring you here. Every single time he came out, he'd say it. She said, "Why didn't he?" Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was afraid. Afraid that if you came here and saw what this place was, you'd want more. Want the whole thing to be different, the whole life to be different. Want him to be different. He thought if he showed it to you while he was alive, it would change what you expected from him, and he didn't know if he could meet what you'd expect. Dorothy sat with this. She sat with the specific sadness of it, the shape of a man who had understood clearly what he was failing to be and had chosen to accommodate the failure rather than attempt the change, who had loved well in the hidden places and failed in the visible ones, who had been human in the way that is hardest to forgive and hardest to dismiss, the way that contains more love and more cowardice than either seems to deserve on its own. She said he was right that it would have changed my expectations. Harlan said yes, probably. She said, but he was wrong that he couldn't have met them. Harlan said probably right about that too. The darkness was complete now, the meadow invisible beyond the pool of light from the cottage windows. The maples gone to shadow the stone walls disappeared into the night. The October air was cold and smelled of fallen leaves, and the particular freshness that follows the first real cold of the season. the smell of something arriving rather than departing. Dorothy Calloway sat on the porch of the cottage at Ridgewood House in Harwick, Massachusetts, in the dark and the cold of an October evening. 68 years old, a cup of tea she had stopped thinking about drinking in her hands, a friend sitting in the chair beside her. Four women inside the warmly lit cottage who had arrived frightened and were becoming slowly less frightened, finding as she had found that the place they had been most afraid of was simply the place where they had to figure out who they actually were. She sat with the knowledge of what she had survived and what she had built and what she still intended to build. And she sat with the complicated love she bore for a man who had protected her in every way available to him and failed her in every way that required presence. And she sat with the understanding that both of those things were simultaneously true and that the truth of one did not cancel or diminish the truth of the other. She was 68 years old. She was not finished. She was not anywhere near finished. 40 years of making other people's lives work. That was what she had. That was the material she was bringing to this. And now, for the first time, the life in question was her own. There was a barn full of chairs and a meadow going into its winter dormancy, and 20 acres with good stone walls, and 6 cottage rooms for women who needed somewhere to land. There was a town that had known her name for 40 years before she ever set foot in it. There was a clear October night and a friend who understood the value of being present without explaining himself. It was enough. More than enough. It was exactly where she was supposed to start. She set her cup on the porch railing. She looked at the dark meadow and the darker sky and the stars that were visible over Harwick in a way they had never been visible over Boston, because Harwick was small enough and dark enough that the sky above it was still actually the sky, enormous and cold and full of the particular abundance of light that can only be seen from a place that does not compete with it. She looked at those stars for a long time. She did not make any decisions, and she did not plan anything, and she did not perform anything for anyone. And the night was cold and clear and entirely quiet, and she was in every sense she could measure, and in several she could not exactly where she was supposed to be.